Hello friends, welcome to Research Life. I am your host, Dr. Sabyasachi Sengupta, founder and director of Sengupta's Research Academy and practicing vitreoretinal surgeon in Mumbai. Research Life is a platform meant to ignite the spirit of clinical research amongst all of us. Here I host some of the most eminent researchers in India and am confident that their journey will inspire us all.
Dear friends, welcome to another episode of Research Life. I hope you have been enjoying the previous episodes hearing from the stalwarts about their research and publications journey. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Lingam Gopal, who has taught, influenced, motivated, and really inspired an entire generation of vitreoretinal surgeons in India and Asia over the past few decades, including myself. Dr. Gopal did his MBBS from Andhra Medical College in Visakhapatnam, India, and Masters in Surgery in Ophthalmology from the prestigious Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research in Chandigarh. He then went on to do a fellowship in vitreoretinal surgery from the Medical Research Foundation at Shankar Nethralaya in Chennai from April 1983 to 84. He pursued and completed an MSc in epidemiology from the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene at the age of 60, showing that it's never too late to pursue higher education and specialized research training. And as you will see through this interaction, he still believes that he is a student, which is remarkable and so inspirational. Currently, he is a senior consultant and associate professor at the Department of Ophthalmology at the National University Hospital in Singapore since 2011 and a senior investigator at the Singapore Eye Research Institute. Before that, he has occupied various leadership positions at Shankar Nethralaya in Chennai, including the head of vitreoretinal department and director of Medical Research Foundation from 1984 to 2011. He has been the principal investigator or a co-investigator in many funded projects from national and international funding agencies on various aspects of retinoblastoma, uveitic entities, retinal dystrophies, ocular angiogenesis, anti-VEGF therapies, and more recently on vitreous substitutes. He has published more than 200 articles in top peer-reviewed index journals and serves as a reviewer for all major ophthalmic journals. He has contributed more than 20 chapters in ophthalmic textbooks, and his seminal contributions in the field of chorioretinal colobomas has influenced practice patterns around the world. Dr. Gopal has been the recipient of more than 20 major awards and orations across the world, the major ones being the American Academy of Ophthalmology Achievement Award in 2008, the Honor Award from the American Society of Retina Surgeons in 2014, the Achievement Award from the Asia Pacific Academy of Ophthalmology in 2016, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Khoo Teck Puat Hospital in Singapore in September 2015. We know him fondly as LG Sir and have looked up to him for guidance and inspiration for many years. Without further ado, let's welcome the legendary Dr. Lingam Gopal to Research Life.
So thank you so much for doing this with us and welcome to the show, and I'm sure we are going to learn a lot from all your experiences over so many years.
It's my pleasure, Dr. Sengupta, and I appreciate the good work you're doing, trying to spread the message about research and publications to all the younger generation. Thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. So we would like to start by asking you, how did your research and publications journey start?
I think my research publication journey started right from the time of post-graduation. I finished post-graduation and my thesis subject was on congenital cataract, which I did along with my colleague, and we were encouraged to try and publish it, although it was not compulsory. So immediately after post-graduation, during post-graduation, I could get it published. At least I could write the manuscript and then get it published subsequently. So that was a great achievement. And those are the days of no computers. So we had to personally type the manuscript ourselves. So I had to borrow the office typewriter during lunch break and tea breaks, and I actually typed it myself. And I learned typing just for the sake of finishing this manuscript. And I think that learning has helped me a lot over a period of time.
So this starts with learning typing, not just Absolutely. The basics of research.
Exactly. I think now that we are so dependent on computers, if you don't learn typing, it is like not knowing how to write and then try to learn. That's very important.
Right. Okay. The next we wanted to ask you, did you have a mentor that you looked up to and who has motivated you to, do all of this work?
I'm sure, like everyone, we do have mentors. Some consciously we recognize as mentors. Some subconsciously, they do mentor us without us knowing that they are mentoring us. And like that, we had mentors throughout our career. I think the first and foremost I would like to place on record is during my post-graduation, all the teachers at PGI Chandigarh have been excellent. It was an excellent academic environment. And specifically, I'd like to name Dr. Amod Gupta, Professor Amod Gupta, who has been a real role model for many postgraduates and residents in ophthalmology. And then, of course, my entire life has been shaped by Dr. S.S. Badrinath in Sankara Nethralaya. So he has been my mentor, philosopher, and guide in every respect, not just ophthalmology. I think he's the most important person who has shaped my life.
So I think both of these people have done so much and mentored and motivated so many people. So
Absolutely.
Dr. Amod Gupta was also on this show, the first.
I know.
Yes. So right, sir. Okay. So the next thing we wanted to know is when did you publish your first paper, and what is the role that you played in it, and how did it all come about?
Actually, the first paper, of course, published was the same one which arose out of the thesis I wrote on congenital cataract. Mm-hmm. And of course, the manuscript was written by me initially, but obviously, first time when you write, there will be lots of errors and corrections, etc. And it's Professor I.S. Jain who sort of rewrote it and got it published. But I think, to give credit to myself, the first major publication would be one I published in ophthalmology on coloboma of the choroid, the first few cases of management using silicone oil and vitrectomy. And that was a very good learning experience. Learning in many ways, because what I thought was a nearly good manuscript ready for publication, I gave it to Dr. Badrinath, and he said, why not we have some editorial help? And he put me to Dr. Narsingh Rao in Los Angeles, who put me to Dr. Miss Ann Dawson, who subsequently became managing director of ophthalmology. But at that time, she was chief librarian. So I couriered my manuscript, because those are the days of, again, no computers. And she corrected it with a red ink and sent it back to me. I preserved that manuscript, the corrected manuscript, for almost 15-20 years, because that acted as a very good reference for me as to how to write or maybe how not to write. So she corrected almost every line that I wrote in a beautiful fashion. So that was an excellent learning experience. So it's always good to get it edited by somebody who is good in English as well as in the way it should be written for a medical journal.
And the fact that you have preserved that manuscript for so many years, and the red ink, I think that red ink really catches your attention. Right, sir. The next thing I wanted to know is how important do you think it is to start early in life? Maybe, in MBBS, or maybe people who are doing a BSc and want to do a PhD later on. So, because you've seen people from so many different walks. You've interacted with MBBS students, you have interacted with as well as PhDs and a lot of retina fellows. So you've seen across the spectrum people with different aptitudes, and so how early do you think it is good to start this research journey?
I would say it all depends upon what your aptitude is, and if you really want to be a researcher and publisher, in addition to, of course, patient care, starting early is very, very vital. But again, each person has their own priority. Nothing is right or wrong in life. But what I found over a period of time when I got exposed to the kind of educational programs that go on in India in our era now versus what happens in the West or in Singapore, where I'm currently practicing, there is definitely a little difference between the way people are exposed to the art of publication, the sort of questioning mind, a mind which keeps on asking questions and trying to find answers and inquiry. Those seeds are placed in the minds of people at a very early age in the Western countries and in Singapore educational program. And I'm happy to see that in India also things have changed a lot from the time that we did MBBS to the present era, where people are definitely asking questions and they are trying to publish. I think starting early is definitely very, very important because later in life, your priorities shift. When your priorities shift, you don't give importance to publication or research, and that becomes second priority. And then to acquire that kind of impetus or interest is not easy. While if you had it right from the beginning, it grows, it doesn't subside with time. And publication is, to me, like for a man-eater, tasting blood. So once you've published one, you want to publish more. It really drives you on and on. I think that's very, very important.
I think this tendency of inquiry that is there in these other countries it is slowly shifting towards us. The gradient is towards us, thankfully. So that.
Oh yeah. There's no doubt. India has got a big role to play in the future, because I find tremendous change in the youngsters' outlook, the way they were trained. So, for example, when we did MBBS, we had hardly any exposure to basic sciences. It was all exposure to clinical sciences only. But now you see the MBBS people know a lot of basic science, including basic biology or basic genetics and cell biology, etc., etc. So much so that the starting platform is very strong. So they're able to proceed further once they get into clinical subject.
Right, sir. So then next is, please tell us how you got interested in public health research at a much later part of your career, and do you think formal training enhanced your research outlook, and do you think it is important to have formal training in clinical research methodology as you go along?
I think in a way that's I'll probably start by saying that again, these days MBBS curriculum, everything includes a modicum of biostatistics, and most people are trained to some extent at least to understand what is mean mode deviation, standard deviation, etc., etc. But perhaps they don't have in-depth knowledge of how to analyze data, how to present data, etc. I think to me, doing that MSc course in epidemiology from University of London has really helped me. Fortunately, I had a lot of time on my hands because I shifted just then from Chennai to Singapore, and I was alone. So basically, entire Saturday and Sunday I had time. So entire Saturday and Sunday I used to spend only on this course. So I spent about 3.5 years or so, and I completed first PG diploma, and then I did MSc as well. I think that exercise was very, very useful. And I think that helps me not only in evaluating others' publications, help them in how to analyze the data better, but of course write my own manuscripts better. I think that formal training is very, very useful. Although we did have little exposure to biostatistics in our post-graduation, then I did a 6-week course in Chennai. So a little bit of input is there, but that was not enough. This 3-year training really was very useful.
Right.
So I would definitely strongly encourage people to do this course, even if it's an online course, even if it costs a little money. It's very, very, very useful. Yes.
Right. I think it's very inspiring to see that even after a lot of clinical experience, that you had this in your mind that I need better training and
it helps you. I think this course helps you not only in, of course, biostatistics and analyzing the data, which kind of tests you do for what. All that is secondary. Very often those we can give to statistician to do. But the approach to analysis of the data itself is taught to us. And the approach on how to write a grant application, something which is never taught in India, is taught to us here. The basic approaches are beautifully dealt with.
I have also done a little bit of course creation where I have a online lecture series, and I have a little bit of this kind of training just to seed the idea and for people to realize whether it interests them or not, if at all. It's a small course, but then if somebody is interested, they can of course build up on it.
That's good.
Going
That's
forward.
great.
So the next thing is that after having heard the slight differences or the differences between basic research scenario in Singapore as compared to India, what about research grants available in Singapore, and any message on how we can improve the overall scenario in India?
There are research grants available in India. Probably we don't know how to tap the exact grants and how to apply for them and persist and pursue those grants and get them. But things again have changed a lot. From the time I joined Shankar Nethralaya, we had hardly anybody applying for ICMR grant or DBT grants. These days, there's tremendous competition for DBT grants and ICMR grants. And both LV Prasad Institute, Shankar Nethralaya, Aravind Hospital, All India Institute, they all get very good grants from these central agencies. I'm not saying the amount of money they give is enough. I'm sure it can be more. Likewise, support to, this is a little controversial area, the animal experimentation. Unfortunately, in medicine, you don't cross a point, you don't cross the threshold unless you step into that area. There's no meaning in doing lots of in vitro work and then stop at one point, not knowing what to do beyond that. Unless you go beyond that and do experimental animal work as well, you won't reach the final point of transition. And unless you do the translational step as well, it's of no use for the society at large. So people seem to think animal surgeries, animal experimentation is bad. But yes, if you use it judiciously within the expected regulations, etc., it helps the society at large. And without animal experimentation, we just don't proceed forwards at all. And that's one major reason why Indian research doesn't progress beyond a point. We don't really generate things which can actually be used on a human being at large. We are only trying to replicate what somebody else has done. So if we really want to do something earth-shaking, something that actually changes the way we practice medicine, it has to go beyond just in vitro studies. Otherwise, as I said, we just tweak a little bit and make small additions to what has been already done. No major research is possible.
Right.
This is my strongest belief, yes. Right. And that is where I could probably progress a little more in Singapore, because I had access to the animal facilities, and we could do a good, useful work on vitreous substitutes. It is still progressing, that work. Right. But I could progress much greater than I would have done in India because of sheer lack of facilities.
Right. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to know is that your understanding of concepts of biostatistics are better than most researchers. I've seen your reviews for the IGO, and I've interacted with you also. So how do you approach biostatistics, and how do you convey your ideas to a statistician? I'm sure your additional training has now really enhanced those skills, but even before, how did you really approach that?
I don't know how to put across as an answer, straightforward answer, but I guess by trial and error, you need to apply your mind. And each time I get an article for review, leave alone my own articles, I tend to go into my biostatistics and analyze it. I always keep all the modules that I have read for my exams for the University of London with me, and I verify them and see. Plus, we know that Google is always there to help us in trying to help us in seeing which statistical test is better, etc. So I don't hesitate to go and search the literature to see what is best before giving a review of an article which comes for review. So instead of being very superficial about the review process and trying to say is it good for publication or not, I try to use an opportunity to learn from that article as to what is good or what is bad in it, how it could be been made better. And very often, I think if you have seen my reviews, I have always indicated to the author how we can modify it so that it make it better rather than try to reject it. So trying to help them to make the analysis better also helps you in understanding statistics better. So that's how I worked on biostatistics.
Okay, so the next thing we wanted to know is, as far as manuscript preparation goes, is there any particular section you prepare first? What approach works for you best?
I think it also depends upon what you are trying to write up about. If say case series, everything is already done, you can start from beginning to end in a sequence, no problem. But if it is something like an experimental data you are trying to publish, then easiest to write is the method section, because that's already prefixed. That's been almost written up even at the grant level itself. So you write the methodology first, and then next section that you write is the results section. In fact, methodology you can start writing even when the experiments are going on. And then you can sort of tweak them a little bit depending upon whether you have changed the methodology in between. And then the results section comes. In the results also, the initial results can be first added up. Then if suppose there's some staining is being awaited, etc., those you keep on adding later on. So once the results section also is ready, then of course you write the discussion. The last we write the introduction and abstract. And the title you can write anytime you want. You can alter it even the last minute, but those are things which can wait. What should be written in the sequence is methodology, results, then the final discussion. And as we write the results and we are getting information from literature, we should have a separate sort of a notepad on which we keep writing points for possible discussion. Because those we tend to forget very quickly. So when you read the literature and we are doing the results section, those ideas should, as they come, you must write it down on a notepad. And those all could be incorporated in the discussion. And I also forgot to tell that even before we write even methodology, first thing that we do is to, of course, collect literature of all the published literature related to the subject and put them in slots depending upon your experiment or your manuscript. It has obviously several components to it. For each component, you will have separate manuscripts published, and each should be tagged with the year. I always, when you download the manuscript, published manuscripts, I always rename them as a 2016 and also what the main feature is in it. So it's easy for me to get across to that. So like that, if you slot them or subfolder them in your literature survey, that helps you to sort of go through them again and again and gives you ideas for writing the discussion. This is the basic approach.
I think it's a great tip to the way you label them and you subgroup them, because I think that essentially leads to the whole discussion being so much better than what it could have been.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the next thing we wanted to know was, is there any particular paper or a group of papers which have been your favorite or most impactful? There have been so many groups, but then any one that you think has, been the most impactful?
I think basically the paper the subject on which I worked, which was different from the routine publications on colobomas, and I had a reasonable number of publications in peer-reviewed journals. So at least in ophthalmology itself, I had about 4 publications, one in current opinion, one in IJO, etc., etc. So that, to me, of course, is my most important contribution to literature. I also had a reasonable number of publications in ROP, but those are all trying to publish the Indian experience, not that these are original experience. There may be few thought process may be different from the West, but the ROP experience in India started much later than in the West. And since everything is a replica of what has been done already in the West. But colobomas definitely is a totally original publication, so I'm happy to say that is my original contribution.
That's right. I think, those original papers have been cited so many times, especially those ophthalmology papers have been, I don't know how many times they've been cited, but they've really created that niche. People have, followed suit, which is great to see.
Okay.
That's it. So the next thing we wanted to know is there any particular thing that you're working on right now that you want to share with the listeners, without maybe giving away too much? But
no, one area I was working on as soon as I reached Singapore was on vitreous substitutes, and we were working on these thermoreversible gels as a vitreous substitutes. So I was lucky to collaborate with a specialist in polymer science, and along with the help of that basic scientist come ophthalmologist and this other third person who is a polymer scientist, we formed a group, and I was lucky to get the first grant from the Singapore government. And then after the initial work, which showed some promising results, we got a second grant also. Second grant is almost getting over now. Okay. So we could publish in international peer-reviewed journals about this thermoreversible gel, but we are still working on it so that we can try to bring it into the clinical application itself. So I'm not sure how much time it will take for us to tweak it and bring it to a level where it can be used on a first-in-human trial. But yes, we are trying our best. We are trying our best on that. There's one area I was working. Second area is more of my collaboration is mostly trying to help and do the surgery on the animals for the RPE transplant work. So my collaborator, Professor Suzini, she is the research scientist and ophthalmologist. So her primary research is on cell therapy for retinal disorders. So I help her in that research as well. So some of the publications are coming out as a co-author in those publications, but that was not primarily my area or research or my primary grant application. Right. Primary grant application is from my collaborator. I'm just a co-author, a co-investigator. Right. These are the two areas I'm working on. Yes.
Nice. Very promising fields, especially that we come across so many problems with the correct existing the substitutes. So I hope we'll see a lot of improvements from your group. Right. Now, what is the importance of these MD PhD programs that are offered by a lot of these international universities, which we don't really have? So these scientists, they are really basic scientists as well as clinicians. So they really have a very large purview of the whole problem. So what is your take on MD PhD programs, and do you think we can actually introduce some of these in India?
Absolutely. I think that if I can start my medical career all over again, I would join the MD PhD program. I think that's one of the best ways of having a very broad horizon and trying to do both basic science and clinical science at the same time. I must tell you that SNEC, Singapore National Eye Centre, I don't work there. I work in National University Hospital, which is a much smaller eye department. But Singapore National Eye Centre is a very large eye department. You all know about it. Every retinal surgeon currently in SNEC is a PhD. They all did PhD or they are doing PhD. So they have been encouraged by their boss to do a PhD even while they are practicing clinical ophthalmology. So that really puts them on a very, very high footing in terms of their research caliber. So when you do PhD, obviously you are already doing high quality work to be able to publish. and that puts you on a very, very high level platform, so that your ability to think sideways, lateral thinking becomes much better. And already you have some ideas about what the basic scientists are doing because you're interacting with them on a routine basis. So your ability to think outside the box will be much, much higher than a pure clinician. I think that's the need of the day.
I think I really like when you said that if I could go back and do it all over again, I would possibly get involved in an MD PhD program.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so the next thing I wanted to ask you is slightly away from the actual clinical experiences is how did you manage to devote time to your research activities despite being so busy with clinical and administrative duties?
I think it's your passion which drives your time allotment, and prioritizing and trying to create time for things which you love to do is what you need to do. Otherwise, things won't get done, because I think if we don't like what we are doing, we try to push it down to the lowest priority, and we'll give excuses for not doing it. But if it's something you like to do, then you will create time. Like all the publications, all the manuscripts I have written in Shankaracharya, I wrote only after working hours or on Sundays. It was never during working hours, because even our so-called administrative academic off day was utilized for seeing some art patients trickling in or some other administrative works. It was never useful to write papers or to do research, quality research work. So all this, which require sort of dedicated time, undisturbed time, I could only do it after working hours. So I sometimes used to go back to the hospital after 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and then work until late 10:30, so that you have undisturbed time. You can sit and do your work. I guess you have to do that, otherwise you cannot achieve anything. I hope that in the future, our at least these academic institutions give time off for clinicians who are involved in research and publications without it affecting their financial returns. What happens is when they weigh that those 2 days their output to the institution is not much, financially speaking, their salary will come down. So because of that reason, many clinicians are not able to bestow time on pure research or pure academic activities. So if only there is some way that this also can be reimbursed, I'm sure you'll have more people writing papers. Otherwise a really interested person will not find an excuse. He will find some way or other time. As somebody said, if you want to get things done, give it to the busiest person. Then you'll get it done. Not to the person who is sitting idly. He will not do it for you.
Right.
So I'm sure you'll find time. You'll find time.
I think prioritizing is so crucial in any activity that we take up. Right. So then something more I wanted to ask you is about your passion for teaching, and that we have seen and experienced ourselves, and so many have across the Indian spectrum of vitreoretinal surgery. So can you tell us a little bit about your approach to teaching? Did you constantly think about teaching? How can I become a better teacher in addition to becoming, of course, a better surgeon? But then teaching came naturally to you almost. But then did you think about it, and how did you impart so many qualities to people?
I don't think I thought about it, but I would say a lot of things came because I had a very good teacher in Dr. Vadinath. And he was one of the best teachers I ever had. I mean, in terms of both the practical surgical training and theory, as well as practice of ophthalmology in general. So I learned a lot of things subconsciously itself in the way he used to explain things. He used to take time in explaining the basic concepts very, very clearly, so that your basic foundations are good. And I also found over a period of time that when you try to explain a concept to somebody, your concepts become clearer. Otherwise, they remain woolly in your mind, and you tend to go on with that woolly concept because nobody questioned it and you never had time to think whether your concept is correct or not. But when you try to explain something to somebody, then your concepts become clear. Your doubts also come up to surface, so that you go back to the books, clarify your doubts, and then explain better. So I think teaching is the best way of learning yourself. Number one. Number two, once you teach somebody, it is almost equal to reading the same chapter about 3-4 times. So it sort of reinforces the concepts in your mind. So it allows you to remember concepts better when you keep on trying to teach people. So I think these are two very selfish reasons that I try to teach, because it helps me become better. It helps me to remember concepts better, clarify my thoughts better. And I usually find that when you try to teach students, especially the fellows, when you're assisting them, when they're assisting you, or when you are trying to supervise them, some of them are so brilliant that you get ideas from them. So it's a two-way learning process. So you learn from everybody. So it's wrong to think that you are a teacher. I would say that you are a teacher and a student at the same time.
The last thing I wanted to know is any special message for the young ophthalmologists and the old ophthalmologists listening to us, how they can improve or how they can get better. Any particular message that you want to send out?
I thought I wrote actually a small brief summary so that the message can be more clear rather than random and going all over the place. I will read out what I have written for you.
Please.
That one is that writing papers is not the same as doing research. We all started with writing case reports, case series, but that doesn't take you beyond a point. You don't get that what they call as the mind of inquiry, which is important for a research scientist. You must step into the era of prospective studies or converting a concept into a translational medicine into something that can be actually used in patient care. That kind of research, if we do only, it will be true quality research. So writing papers is not equal to doing research. It can be called as clinical research, but that's not real research in my mind. What I'm talking about is going forward. So as a beginning point, no harm done when you're beginning. Start with case reports, case series, no problem. You should definitely write them. Beyond that, you should start thinking, can I do a small prospective study? It can be clinical study. But doing a prospective study really again does conceptualize this thought process very well. It's like what it does is it can be even observational. It goes a long way in refining the research culture in the person. It helps one bring in clarity to thought process. You try to put your thoughts or objectives on a paper, then only you realize, is my idea really worth working on or not? So because you need to go through literature and see, has it been already published? If it's not published, I can do this. Or maybe go a little beyond the published data. So first you write down your thought process, which produces clarity of thought. Second, can I convert these woolly ideas into specific points, objective 1, objective 2, objective 3? And can a clear-cut plan of collection of data, including case selection, organizing the patient flow, and then understanding the importance and concepts of a consent process, the ability to reduce gray areas to the minimum. Everything is crystallized now. So that is very, very important. And plan in advance the kind of statistical analysis you would need to do. What are the numbers required to come to a possible study, with good statistical power, etc. Because very often we find at the end of the study, due to do all the statistical analysis, you find the power of the study is very, very weak. So you can't make any strong statement from your study because you didn't recruit enough cases at all. So you should be able to have all these in your mind when you plan the study. So my suggestion is that let people do a prospective study. It can be very, very small clinical study, it need not be basic research. But doing a prospective study is very important, and executing it and completing it on time and bringing out a paper out of it. If all these are done well, that really puts them up as a good researcher for the future. But I think the highest level of research goes even beyond this. We basically take a question and try to find answers for the same. The question can be understanding a disease better, such as a genetic basis, genetic studies of inherited disorders, or addressing an unfulfilled need. And that's something you know as you do clinical practice. This particular area, we are not having enough armamentarium to offer to the patient care. So that unmet need is what is very important to look at. And once you find the unmet need, try to see whether we can rectify it in a small way. In today's research environment, research outcome should have application to the society at large. It cannot be research for the sake of research. It's got to have an application to the society. And I don't think any grant agency will fund you a project unless it has an application to the society at large. Lastly, good quality and high impact research can only come with a collaborative effort, not by a single person. So those days are over where you can keep the idea within yourself until the date is published. That's all gone. You have to share your thoughts with others, especially other specialties, interact with them, and a good networking, ability to work with other specialties is very important to bring out anything substantial for the society at large. This is the brief summary of a message I would like to give to the people at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really well put in terms of it sort of brought in all the elements, it tied them all together. I think it's very well put. Thank you, sir. So that brings us to the end of the show, and we really thank you, LG sir, for taking this time and spending so much valuable inputs from all your journey with us. And
thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm sure we'll see more of you and your influence on the residents and fellows at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.